evening, students, teachers, and all who are interested in the Constitution of American life. By overwhelming popular demand of our wives, girlfriends, boyfriends, children, cousins, and a few of our other friends, the Friends of Publius are back for another season of discussion, debate, and fellowship. Not much has happened since we last saw you. Yes, we are in another phase of the pandemic and pandemic life, which I'm sure students and teachers, you are thrilled with that whole experience. And yes, the clouds of war might be gathering over Ukraine, and the Supreme Court has upended hundreds of years of precedent, but life goes on as always. Just as an example, every Los Angeles professional sports team has mastered the concept of disappointing fans. We have missed you, and for surety, we have missed each other. In the last season, in the last episode, I let you know that we were meeting together in San Diego to plan for this season's episodes, and that you would know just how that went by whether or not you actually see us again. So here we are. No wounds, no hatred. We are back together, and there is joy in American land. And so we are ready to move forward. I will say, however, that the most interesting aspect that I learned from our time together in San Diego during our planning session was that, and in fact, what was really funny is it was really about reliving college, because hanging together in Mike's little abode was really like being in college again for the rest of us. But here's what the number one thing I learned is you never want to go shopping, all right, for sausage with a man from Wisconsin. All right. So don't ever do that. Don't go sausage shopping with a man from Wisconsin. So boy, oh boy, do we have a great discussion tonight. We're going to address Unit 1, Question 1 from the National Finals Program, which focuses upon the idea of civic virtue, the Judeo-Christian tradition, and morality and law and policy. I would like to start out this discussion by focusing on a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. Given the time and place that we are at right now, I think it would be appropriate. Speaking on the issue of morality and law, he said, "It may be true that morality can not be legislated, but behavior can be regulated." He went on to say, "It may be true that law cannot change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. It may be true that law can't make a man love me, but it can restrain him from lynching me." And I think that's pretty important also. That's Martin Luther King Jr. In that context, here is the questions that we will be addressing tonight, and forgive me if I am paraphrasing somewhat. In what ways, if any, are the concepts of civic virtue in the classical Republican tradition and private morality in the Judeo-Christian tradition similar or different? How did the Enlightenment impact the founders' views on civic virtue, private morality, and relationship between the people and their government? To what extent, if any, does morality or civic virtue matter in the 21st century governance? And before I pass this off to my colleagues, I do want to point out something that I do believe is relevant. In my research for tonight's discussion, it was brought to my attention that Judeo-Christian tradition is somewhat a myth. This phrase did not come to the attention of the American people until the 1930s. So therefore, I think it's reasonable then to say that the founders framers did not have this concept in mind as they were having their discussion and debates. Christian tradition, maybe, but Judeo-Christian is a propaganda tool created in the 20th century to separate us from fascists and communists. So, gentlemen, before we get too much in depth, what I'd like to ask you is, what would you suggest to students in regards to how to approach this question? What, in your sense, is the essence, the core of this question, and they want students to know and be able to talk about? So, Professor Kavanaugh, what's your insight into this question?
Well, to tag on with what you were talking about, David, I think it was actually George Orwell who was the first person to use Judeo-Christian in print in a book review in 1939. I'm just going to throw that out there. I could be wrong, but I think he was the first person to use that, doing a type of book review. I think this is for the students and for the teachers watching. I think this question is what I see as a very traditional Unit 1 question, right? Because we know so Unit 1 spends so much time on the classical republicanism of Greece and Rome, ancient Greece and Rome. Then they fast forward to through the idea of um, capitalism, the feudal system, and into the Enlightenment, and this whole idea of this natural rights philosophy of the Enlightenment. So I see this as being somewhat of that kind of boilerplate Unit 1 kind of question to contrast the classical republicanism and the natural rights philosophies, but probably with a little more emphasis, as you mentioned, David, reading the question about the idea of private morality versus public morality.
Professor Williams, what do you think they're asking students? What do you think the core of this question is about?
Yeah, I mean, building on what Chris has said, you know, um, in our culture, there's this distinction sometimes made between the private and public sort of sectors, right? And I think this question is asking students to really think about how one can live in a political community where one's private values may or may not be aligned with the political or public values, either the values and virtues that exist or the ones that we're aspiring towards. Um, and I think it's really important for students to think about their own experiences in terms of how they relate to their family and closest friends, right? In terms of, I would say, being loving and affectionate and being partial, like you're rooting for your family and friends. And that's the private sphere. And students need to think about, how do we then, in the public sphere, deal with others who may have different sets of values, different interests? How do we act in a way that maybe is a little more impartial, right? To get at what is good for the whole rather than just what's good for our family. So I think the students can really think about their own life experiences and their own family experiences and thinking about how that relates to what they do when they step out into their role as a citizen.
So, Professor Moore, when I saw this, I was thinking about ultimately what it's asking. It's asking about citizenship. What are the characteristics? What are the attitudes and aptitudes of being a good citizen and as being a good representative there? Do you see that any differently, or am I somewhat on the right path? And what do you think
No,
about?
I think in some ways you've cut right to the chase there, because in any citizenship discussion, there's always the principle of what are you loyal to. And I think in the classical Republican tradition, there's a real commitment to horizontal commitments, the community. And so you're a citizen of a community. In fact, the community defines you. In the classical Republican tradition, the community tells you what the morals are, tells you who the virtuous are. So it's all horizontal. It's all, I think, what some sociologists might call sociological morality. Now, for those that like Christians would say morality, there's a vertical nature to it. It's there's a transcendent being. If let's assume for a minute Judeo-Christian can go together, and I like your caveat to start out with that. But for Jews and Christians, there's a transcendent being that defines what the morals are. And so I think and so that loyalty is to the transcendent and the lawgiver and the law definer, the moral definer. So I think you're onto something there, that this is about citizenship and what you're loyal to, a horizontal community or a God or a deity defining the morals. And so that loyalty principle, I think, is critical. So I think you're onto something there on that citizenship configuration.
Well, is it wrong? I'm just wondering, Tim, because you say horizontal and vertical. Horizontal implies that there's no hierarchical. Is it your understanding then that in the classical Republican tradition, there's no hierarchical, structure there?
No, I wouldn't. I would. Maybe I. That's not a conclusion that I would draw. All I'm saying is that there's not the issue of transcendence is not there in classical republicanism. It's all, what do we as a polis want to define as the morals? Who are the virtuous individuals we're going to model our lives on? We're not. I mean, one of the critique of classical republican deities is they're created in man's image. The classical republican communities create their gods, and so Yahweh is different in the Jewish tradition because he creates man in his image, not the other way around. So hierarchialism is not what I was getting at. I was just saying the transcendent nature of morals is different.
Well, and then that leads me to follow up on that, because I'd like you and to make sure that for the remainder of our conversation, we're kind of all using the same language, is to kind of just, I know amongst the four of us, if that's even possible, but is your understanding of civic virtue and these Judeo-Christian private morality ideas. I guess my point is I agree with you. That is, in the classical tradition, you can't even have a republic unless virtue exists. And it's not only organic, but it's also the responsibility of the community, right, through moral education to teach those virtues, because they are so fundamental to that. But I am wondering if you could define for us or articulate for us your understanding of those two terms that the students have to deal with. That is, what is civic virtue? And this harkens back to a nightmare scenario for me in 1998 at national finals, where that was the question that the judge asked: what does civic virtue look like? What's it look like? So if you could, kind of deal with that, plus what is your understanding of virtue? What's it look like? And then also, what is your understanding of the Judeo-Christian idea of morality?
Wow.
Yeah, I know. That was
now
terrible.
bear in mind, to those that are watching this, I had a eureka come to Jesus moment, no pun intended here. I had a come to Jesus moment when we ran a how big of the conversational piece of pie chart was unveiled. And it turns out I have the loudest mouth and dominate the discussions. And so, David, you asked me that question.
Yeah, there's a game I'm going to go watch.
Yeah.
It's not on yet. All right, I'm watching the clock because it's my team that's playing tonight.
Students should know that they can speed it up. They can watch this like twice as fast. So when it lasts 2 hours, they can watch it in an hour.
Just scan through whenever Moore's talking. Just scan through it real fast. I guess I come back to this notion that in the classical Republican tradition, public morality, the things we define as virtuous, are important. Now, in the Christian tradition, it's much harder because they would like, nice behaviors, moral behaviors, but generally, coming out of the Reformation, they were not willing. A lot of the reformers were not willing to exclude the notion of that there needed to be some private conversion or commitment to the transcendent for there to be public virtue. So and that's a tension. I think within the Christian tradition, you have this vertical commitment, loyalty. You have this internal heart conversion. You're now a Christian. You've been converted, and now in some ways it should be easier to behave publicly virtuous if there's this internal conversion that experience. But that loyalty is a tough one, I think, for Christians to walk that line to be in the kingdom of man and the kingdom of God. So that's a hard, it's probably like a Venn diagram in some ways. The public virtues being connected to private internal morality.
Well, Chris, Professor Kavanaugh, what are the virtues? When they talk about civic virtue, and again, I'm ready here because I found that Franklin actually articulated 13 virtues there. But so I don't want to go through those. But when they talk about civic virtue, what are the virtues that are necessary for Republican government?
Well, I think Tim alluded to it, but I think it's the idea is like what you want as an individual is not nearly as important as what's best for the community. So if you're asking me, what does it look like? Are we going back to your 1998 nightmare scenario? Is that what you're asking me?
Yeah. And you know who I'm talking about, University of Pennsylvania, Unit 1 scholar.
Yeah.
All right. Destroyed my kids and he kept asking over and over, what does virtue look like?
I think virtue looks like a little library box on the corner where you can take a book and read a book. I think virtue looks like a person that may be nervous about it, but gets vaccinated. I think virtues is the idea that, well, I as an individual, I'm not a smoker, but if I was a smoker as an individual, I want to smoke. But virtue, civic virtue, would mean I'm not going to smoke or I'm not supposed to. I think that's what it looks like. I think the idea is that what I want as an individual is not as important as what's determined by the community, or Tim used the word polis earlier, the polis that I exist in. So I have to agree to live by that. And I do love this idea that within that classical Republican idea, citizens are made, they're not born. And we think in our society today, citizens are born, some are made, but we think about birthright citizenship. In the classical Republican sense, citizens had to be made, right? So you had that whole idea of that education that went with it, that moral education that you all went through. I do think there's a distinct difference, though, between civic virtue and public morality. Private morality. There's a distinct difference because and I love the way that Tim used the horizontal and vertical idea, because in that sense, in that Judeo-Christian sense, we'll use that term since that's in the question. It really is a top down. These are the rules. We'll call them, I don't know what, commandments. These are the rules, and you're supposed to follow these because this is what's going to get you into heaven, right? So you too can transcend. So I think it's a very narrow focus in the Judeo-Christian sense, where it's a much more broad focus in the classical Republican sense.
Well, for students, I want to check and make sure, because again, this was the toughest unit for me to teach and talk about. Am I correct to understand that in the classical tradition, there's a very limited notion of the individual? The idea of individual rights and individual role within society, am I correct to say that that's very limited? And that's thrown out to anybody who wants to jump on it.
I would agree. I would also, if we want to get a little knee deep in the woods for students, if you want to try and for students to try and separate yourselves from other units, and don't just lump in Roman classical republicanism with Athenian classical republicanism, because they're distinctly different in terms of the Athenian or the ideas. Like there's maybe more small d democratic than when you get to the Roman side of things, which is maybe a little more representative or Republican. So I'll throw that in there.
And I would add that even within sort of the Athenian tradition, there are differences in terms of how Aristotle saw classical republicanism and how Plato saw it, right? I mean, I think that Plato was someone who said the polis is kind of like a human body, and different parts are more important than other parts, right? So you can have these different statuses in your society and still be consistent with this notion of, I guess, civic virtue. I just want to add, I think this, Chris, I think this is exactly what you're saying. To me, the way to define what civic virtue looks like, it's self-restraint in the public sphere. And for students, this can be hard because right now we're thinking so abstractly about these big concepts. But I think at some point you need to ground it in, okay, what does civic virtue look like in the American experience, right? And in the American experience, can we agree that there are some oughts, right? Some things that we shall do as citizens, and that what civic virtue looks like is within our democratic, Republican, liberal tradition, exercising self-restraint and doing what ought to happen looks like civic virtue. So let me just give you one quick example. And this is something I read today, so it's not my original idea. But when Senator Romney voted to impeach Trump, he in his speech, he said, look, I'm a Republican and I have certain beliefs and loyalty to my party, but there is an ought here. There is something that the Constitution, which is, I think, a way we can think about what our embodied sort of civic virtue looks like. I have to do it, right? I can't do just what I want and what's good for me or for my party. I have to do what I think is good for the particular polis that we're living in. So as much as you can, students, think about, define civic virtue, see how it's different than private morality, but then contextualize it in the American experience. I think that's going to be useful in your answers.
I couldn't help but think, is it fair to say, I'll run this around the group, is it fair to say that the Declaration and the 14th Amendment contains our morals, public morals, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and then the 14th talks about equality and fairness. So if those are our morals that we've decided as a polis, those morals ought to look, I like Chris's, here's what it looks like. So if those are our morals, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, equality, and fairness, what are the behaviors that connect to those morals? Now, I know we could argue about, the moral content of who we are, but I just, for the sake of discussion, let's take those 5. What are the behaviors that would tether to those morals?
Is that a rhetorical question or a direct question to the rest of us?
Well, I'm channeling a book. I don't think it's even in print, nor do I have it here to show. It was a great book written by R. Freeman Butts.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, snicker. But he went. I think the title of the book was something like Democratic Morality, and so I'm kind of riffing on some of his ideas that because he identified these moral principles and then said, here's what the behaviors would look like. So it was a really fascinating, it's not a thick book, pretty thin book. And I think the Center for Civic Ed at one time they had it on their website. I don't know whether they still do or not, but so that's what I'm kind of asking. If we can identify morals, what would the behaviors look like connected to those 5 morals?
Well, I keep thinking, and I don't know, the right to swing my fist stops at your nose. I mean, which to me seems pretty simple, right? I get to act as an individual as long as I kind of stay in my lane. When I jump the barrier and I end up in one of your guys' lane, then we have. So you have.
Well, I got to ask this because, I've always tried to simplify this down to what I call the 3 S's, but I'll just use one: selflessness. Virtue is selflessness. All right. Where I get hung up is with the so-called Judeo-Christian tradition, which recognizes to some degree some element of individualism. There is how that fits in. And again, to what you said, Chris, that, my rights end to the point at the end of my fist kind of thing. And so I guess my question is, what are the differences between the two? And is virtue equivalent with morality? Because there's my struggle here. We've got this notion of morality, and in the mind of most Americans, and I think to most of our students, they hear morality, they do think about Christian morality or Judeo-Christian, if you want to add that. But when they think about virtues, are they thinking about morality? Are they one and the same, or are they different, Chris?
I think they are different. I think they are. I think when you're thinking of morality, it is defined for each of us as an individual what we think to be moral, right? Um, take abortion. I don't know why I'm going to throw that grenade out there, but that certainly is a live grenade right now. There are many people in this country that believe a woman accessing abortion services is an immoral act. And there are other people believe that women should have the control over their bodies and be able to do that. And they think that is the moral thing. So I think that's a very individual kind of idea. In terms of civic virtue, I'm going to go back to what the word Mike used, and that's ought. How ought I should behave in public, right? It's one thing when I walk into my place and the door closes and, I'm on my own. I can do my own thing. I can think my own thoughts and do whatever I want to. But when I enter into the public sphere,
Yeah.
how ought I behave? Which means I ought to stop at the stop sign. I ought to make sure that my car has brakes. I ought to pay my taxes, right? I have to pay my taxes. So there's certain things that you need to do in the public sphere that in the private sphere, I can think differently. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
I couldn't help but think as you're talking, Chris, that life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness is private. Justice and equality are more public commitments.
Well, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, yes, are private to a degree, right?
Right.
Until I jump my lane and I'm
Right, exactly.
I would agree.
I think that maybe, to me, virtue, we're talking about civic virtue. We're not using the language civic values. And I think that's important to think about. I think, to me, morals are more about values, and they can change. And I think they can be more individualistic, right? I think virtue is more expansive. It's about the human experience. And I think we're trying to think about, as humans, I'm a Christian, she's a Muslim, he's a Jew. We all live in the same polis. How do we take our different private morality and values and still cooperate together in this larger space? What are the virtues that bind us together, right? And that to me is that to me is the key. It's virtue is bigger than the values, I think.
It seems to go ahead, Chris.
Well, I just think for students, something to think about too. I'm listening to these guys discuss this, and I'm thinking, I'm not trying to get us into Unit 5, believe me, but I'm thinking about, Masterpiece Cake Shop. The idea of these cases now where you see people that they're hanging out their shingle to do work in the public sphere, right? Whether you be a master, you bake wedding cakes, or you're a photographer, or you're offering your services to people, but then because of your individual morality, your individual belief system, you don't believe you can participate in, say, a same-sex wedding. So I think that would be a good framework for students to think about playing out this argument.
So I guess, there is, there's these demarcation points in our history. And one of the things the kids had to deal with is I think probably one of the most significant demarcation points is the Enlightenment. And so, Professor Williams, I'm wondering, when we look at this notion of virtue and this so-called Judeo-Christian tradition, and again, I think that Christian tradition predates the Enlightenment. What's the impact of the Enlightenment on these two ideas? And here's my hypothesis. I think that these are very different ideas pre-Enlightenment. But what the Enlightenment does is they bring them closer together. That there might not be such separation between the notion of virtue and the notion of private morality within the Judeo-Christian tradition. That's my hypothesis. What do you think about the impact of the Enlightenment on these ideas and on the ideas of just government in general at the time? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I like the way you framed that, because when I was thinking about this question, social contract. That's an easy, not easy. That's a narrative that Americans, I think, can tell themselves. So this idea of social contract, it's a fascinating idea, right? Because you take the social, this idea that we're living in this community together. But a contract is a very sort of personal idea. And the way Locke and Hobbes envision the social contract is that we're all making these individual agreements with each other and with the state. And through that, we're going to get some political stability and some political order so we can then all thrive. So I think, to me, the notion of social contract is trying to bring together. I think what's happened in the American experience, though, I think the natural rights story is a much easier one to tell than the civic virtue one. And I think sometimes we put too much emphasis on the individualism and the notion of individual rights that comes out of this idea of social contract without then thinking seriously about the duties and obligations that have to be there. And that's the heart of civic virtue. So that's the way I'd address that.
I think there are two R's, right? Rights and responsibilities. And so often we forget that second R. But Tim, I'm sorry, you're gonna jump in, buddy.
Yeah, I think Mike's point about contract is probably that may be the most well, I don't know what the most important thing is, but I got to thinking about the three social contract theorists, and each one of them, they had a different take on what the contract would look like and how extensive it. I mean, Hobbes' social contracts is a totalistic, you contract to a Leviathan. Now, on the other end, you got Rousseau. He thinks, organized society screws up individuals, and your government should be so thin that it's barely there to maximize individual liberty. And so he's totally crazy. And that's why the founders both reject Hobbes and Rousseau, because their contract isn't kind of the middle way of Locke. That's kind of how I see it. Mm. But Mike's point about the Enlightenment takes this individual. What are we going to do with this individual who's important? That comes out of the Renaissance. The individual is important. Man, Da Vinci's Man in the Circle, I think one of the greatest pieces of art in terms of what it's saying. So you put the individual primary. So what are you going to do with that? And all three of them come up with what we're going to do is we're going to have this social contract. So I think the Enlightenment contribution to this is private and personal and problematic, because once you contract, now how much of your individualism can you still have in that contract? Rousseau says maximal, Hobbes says minimal, and Locke tries, I think, to hit the Goldilocks.
Well, I think that the private and the personal that you allude to is then so the emphasis on the private and the personal, how will that play out? And one more P here, the public sphere, right?
Right.
So I think that's what the Enlightenment is going to give these guys. Okay, so here's a roadmap. And as Tim lays out, Locke definitely is not on the crazy train compared to, say, Rousseau, and Hobbes a little less. But so it gives them that roadmap. Okay, how can the private and personal play out in the public sphere, which goes back to what Mike started us with the social contract.
And I can't help but think about how difficult it now becomes when you interject Freud into it, because everything is deeply personal.
Yeah.
In fact, I wonder about the future of consensus if everything is so decentralized, so deconstructed, and so individualized post-Freud. I mean, there's so the political and the personal after Freud becomes the polis becomes maybe impossible after Freud.
Huh. I can't jump on that. I want to jump on something else.
Careful with your phrases here, Mike. Careful.
That kind of blew my mind. I had something else I wanted to say. To remind the students of the Enlightenment thinkers are in this, like, their social contract theory is in this larger argument of trying to say divine right of kings should not be the way we govern ourselves. And to get back to what Tim was saying at the very beginning, the divine right of kings gives you this moral giver. Like, there's no debate about what the civic virtue is. The king or the pope will tell you. So
Yep.
they are trying to disrupt that because the economy is changing and they want to get rid of this hierarchy. They want to give space for individuals to move up the social ladder. So the social contract theory is good for that, right? It allows that to happen. But I think as we're saying, if you focus too much on that and not about, okay, what happens to this glue, these civic virtues that we need to operate together, we can't forget about that piece of the puzzle. It may not come from the king anymore or the Pope, but it's got to come from somewhere. And where do we find that?
And it comes from the state, it seems to me. And, I think of these and the transition of classical thought to post-Enlightenment or Enlightenment thought, to me, is not as difficult as this Judeo-Christian. And Tim, you were talking about the transcendent. And ultimately, all direction comes from God. So the question is, how does the state deal with that, with this Judeo-Christian tradition? And don't they have to be able to fold in, all right, the notion of God into the state? And that, to be a good citizen is to be a good Christian and is to, and ultimately, be in obedience to the state as well.
Well, I mean, Christianity's wrestled with that from the very beginning. The early Christians really wrestled with kingdom of God, kingdom of Rome, and Caesar. So there's a real conflict there. I think from the very beginnings within Christianity, but
something happens during the Enlightenment.
Well, I don't know that it's I don't know. Personally, I don't see the Enlightenment solving that problem because there's
I didn't say solving, but something transcends. And the fact is, loyalty to the nation state is equal to loyalty to God. And in fact, that carries on into the 21st century.
Well, there have been segments of Christianity that have always resisted that. I mean, look at your Mennonites coming out of the Reformation. There's been all kinds of groups within the Christian tradition that have always resisted that. What you want to do, I think in your statement, David, is close that Venn diagram. There's always been Christians that have said, now, wait a minute, those are not overlapping. The state is not sovereign. There's this other transcendent that, and many Christians would articulate that transcends the sovereign state. So I would push back a little bit on that there's
and I'm glad you're pushing back, but using the Mennonites, I'm sorry, is somewhat weak. The Mennonites are a very small group within the Christian community. Let's look at the main denominations within Western Europe and within America. All right. Tim's froze. Okay, I didn't know if I froze.
David, I would go back and check because with the way you described it originally is to be a good citizen, and I would change that. I would say to be in terms of, if you're going to stick with Christianity, to be a good Christian is to be a good person, not necessarily a good citizen.
I disagree with that.
I'm sorry?
I disagree. I think citizenship and personhood is intertwined, all right, especially within the American context of the Enlightenment.
Well, certainly personhood and citizenship is intertwined, but in terms of people of a certain faith, their thought process, I think, I don't want to speak for all people of faith, but I would think their thought process would be, to be a good person, I need to follow these dictates or these teachings, not to be a good citizen, because that's different. That's the different sphere I'll travel in when I leave my house, or I'm not in my house of worship, or I'm not perhaps engaged in prayer, or whatever the dictates of my faith have me, which will overlap. There's no doubt. There's not going to be complete. There's going to overlap there. But the idea is, I think being a good person is different than being a good citizen. Maybe
I would also recommend for your consideration, David, because I want to continue fighting about this. You think, the way I hear my fellow evangelicals a lot in the last 20 years, they're making that same argument that, God trumps, excuse me, I didn't mean to use that word. That the kingdom of heaven is more important than the kingdom and policies of this government. I mean, there's a lot of that rhetoric that has always been around, and I think it's come to the forefront in the last 10, 15 years.
Yeah, but I agree. I mean, I don't know if there's really a debate here. I guess it's semantics. I think this, and again, we're dealing today with this notion of Christian nationalism. And I don't think it's a modern concept. I think the challenge of the framers, and I guess my question to you, Tim, is to what degree did the framers rely on Christian faith and Christian morality, all right, private morality, all right, to help create this republic? You know, whether you call it virtue or Christian private morality, they were expecting certain attitudes and behaviors by citizens in order to maintain a large republic. Am I wrong there?
No, you're not. I mean, there was a heavy reliance on religion. And many of the founders didn't believe that we were long for history if there wasn't a private morality. Now, the better question is, does that mean, and this always gets into this, is America a Christian country or not? It's, you know, you can rely on private morality and to undergird public virtue, but as long as there's a Venn diagram, in other words, they're not exactly the same. I think that's where most of the founders were. They were relying on it, but they weren't going to enshrine it as law. I mean, if that makes sense.
Chris or Mike, you have thoughts on that? I mean, that's, to me, like I said, is the Enlightenment has this influence. And again, Christianity is changing, obviously, because of the Enlightenment there. But if it's focused on government, is how do we persuade, or how do we incentivize, all right, Christianity to buy into the nation state and create good citizens there? And so they connect the state to God, or a higher being, or whatever phrase you want to use. That seems to me to be the influence of the Enlightenment, and I could be way off. I'm just wondering what the rest of you think.
How do we incentivize? We don't make them pay taxes. That's kind of sweet.
Right. Yeah. Well, a lot of the state constitutions had establishment and religious test clauses. And there's a great example.
What's the answer me that? What's the purpose of establishment within a state or a republic? Why would you have an establishment? What's the purpose there, Tim?
To undergird the state. I think that's to your point. Yes. But as we know, there was a disestablishment that started gaining traction after the American Revolution. But I mean, it goes into the 1820s and maybe into the 30s, actually, 1830s, before everything's disestablished at the state level. Now, at the national level, there's obviously a disestablishment in 91 with the First Amendment.
But that doesn't diminish and again, now we move outside the realm of government structure, disestablishment, into politics of using private morality, all right, and virtue as a unifying theme of being a good citizen.
Right. When the founders had great suspicion that a republic could exist without private morality.
And again, Tim and I are kind of down. Mike, thoughts?
I guess I may not know my history from the Enlightenment period as well as all of you do, but I see the Enlightenment period as one responding to the disorder, chaos, and violence that happens when religion and the secular worlds are too connected. I mean, that's what's happening in the 1600s in Great Britain. These are wars about the role of the church and the role of religion. And to me, that strain of Enlightenment is about, okay, let's keep these separate. Let's try to live in a society where you can have your private morality, pray to whatever God, go to whatever church you want, but let's have a separate secular authority set up that we're all contracting to together. And there's going to be certain obligations as a citizen that we're going to have to do, whether we're Catholic, Protestant, or whatever. And then you can go back to your church or go back to your denomination, do what you want. So I guess I see the Enlightenment as trying to make that distinction clearer rather than bring them together. But this may be me just not knowing the history.
No, I think you just articulated what is the mainstream view of it. And I'll be honest, I restrict the mainstream. I reject the mainstream view of this. And I think in a formal way, you're absolutely right, Mike. I think you're right on target. But, we may have tried to do that, but we've never been able to accomplish that.
Well, okay.
Because whether it's private morality, Christianity, however you want to define it, the fact of the matter is government has used this notion of the transcendent or the virtuous as a motivating factor in trying to unify us into a people, a nation, an identity.
Yes.
And that's still true today as we look at the rise, or I don't know if it's the rise or the, affirmation of Christian nationalism, all right, that we see in this country today.
I guess one comment about Enlightenment. A great book years ago, the thesis was there were 4 enlightenments. And so Mike is, to Mike's point about interpreting the Enlightenment, I think the one strand of the Enlightenment, maybe what's called the French and the Continental Enlightenment, does want a clean break from state and church. And then there are these other enlightenments. There's the British Enlightenment, then there's the Scottish Enlightenment, and then the American Enlightenment is the least, I'm going to use the word radical. I don't know if that's quite right, but it's the least committed to this radical clean break that you're talking, that Mike's talking about. So there's different enlightenments that may come into play here as how vigorous that commitment to the separation of church and state is. And as in early American history, in some states, there's not much separation. Yeah. I'm going to suggest that's because the American Enlightenment may be different than the French.
Okay. I have one more thing to say, David. I think I understand your point now. And I would just say that, yes, okay, I agree. When we move from a model of dictatorial or monarchy rule to consensual government, we're going to come together and we're going to agree to set up this government who's going to set laws and regulate us, right? For that government to be legitimate, it must relate and align with the values in that community. And in the American experience, I agree with you, those values predominantly, not exclusively, at the time of the founding are Christian. So I agree with you that it has to be reflected. Like today in South Africa, right, just to take something from another part of the world, South Africa today, in its constitution, it provides for heterosexual marriage, gay marriage, and customary marriage. Like, right? Now, why is that? Well, that is the set of values that the government is trying to govern over. And if they can't set up a government that is not going to be, well, they can, it's just going to be hard to make it legitimate. So you need to align that legitimacy with the values. Now, the thing the students need to think about is that obviously the values in the United States in the 1770s and 1780s and the communities are much different than they are in the 21st century, right? So we need to think about how we then continually rededicate ourselves, right, to this consent form of government as our communities and as our values are changing.
Chris, you've been silent on this conversation.
Well, I'm thinking of a couple things here, and I'm holding up a book, so I know my peers.
So it's part of our shtick to hold up a book at least once a session.
This book, Exploring Political Ideas, Concepts of Our World, for teachers. This is, if you don't have this, add this to your library for Unit 1. This is a fantastic book for Unit 1. There's a part in here where they talk about the morality of duty, and there's a morality of aspiration. And they talk about the morality of duty, and they allude to Machiavelli and Hobbes, and the idea that the state must persevere, right? So the state is for those folks that Niccolo Machiavelli, the prince, maybe the founder of political science, out of the Enlightenment. The state must be preserved, and that means, that's the way when your name gets turned into an adjective, you must be pretty important. So this idea of Machiavellian behavior, the ends justify the means. There's a whole list of things that Machiavelli wrote with it that the leader should be able to do to preserve the state. Hobbes very much, as Tim alluded to earlier, about the Leviathan. Then they go on to talk about the aspiration, the morality of aspiration, and they use Dr. King, very appropriate today as we celebrate Dr. King's birthday, and the idea of what government should look like, what we should try to do within the system to help people, not the preservation of the state, but it's the preservation of the people. And I'm listening to you guys going back and forth, and I can't help it. I just, I learn in hand the spirit of liberty. And if you guys have an American experience, hopefully kids, you have this in the back. There's a excerpt from his speech, and I just love this because I think it gets maybe to the part of this is like, what then is the spirit of liberty? I cannot define it. I can only tell you my own faith. The spirit of liberty is a spirit which is not too sure that it is right. The spirit of liberty is a spirit which seeks to understand the minds of other men and women. The spirit of liberty is a spirit which weighs their interests alongside its own without bias. The spirit of liberty remembers that not even a sparrow falls to the earth unheeded. Little Matthew for you right there. That's right out of, obviously, the Bible, the book of Matthew, chapter 10, verse 29, in case anybody's wondering.
Wow. Wow.
Hey,
yeah. And your point is?
I think that's when we're talking about this debate, right, about civic virtue and private morality. I think that's what Hans getting to. The spirit of liberty. What does liberty mean? Liberty means I get to have my private morality. I get to have my faith. I get to practice how I want. I get to think what is my values. But then when I enter into the public sphere, I have to consider what you guys think, what my neighbors think. So the idea is I can't just say my view trumps your view. I'm the winner, you're the loser. The spirit of liberty is, and that goes back to the whole idea that Mike talked about, the social contract. This is what we have to do within that social contract. No one's for sure about the right answers other than the fact we got to respect other people's views.
So we're gonna, finish on, and hopefully it'll be a somewhat lengthy conversation. And this is something that was one of the best conversations in the classes I taught for 35 years. And that is the question of the relationship between morality and law and morality and policy. So Professor Williams, given that you're a political scientist and deal in policy much more than historians do, does law have to be grounded in morality? Is there a difference between morality and law? Because I hear people say, well, morals shouldn't be legislated. You can't legislate morals. I've heard that my entire life. So I know I've probably given you a lot there. So thoughts, insights on that?
Yeah, I mean, to the question of does law have to be grounded in morality, I would say no, right? It doesn't have to be. I think most legal thinkers would say that there is an important distinction between what we might call morality and law. Now, is it beneficial to have some overlap? Is it beneficial to use the law not only to provide like the substantive values that we want to have in our society, to have them out there and regulated? Should law be a teacher to us of the kind of values and virtues? I think so, but I don't think it dominates every single law that is passed. And I think it can go in the other direction as well, right? I think about prohibition and this idea of where a faction with their private morals imposes a law, constitutional amendment, on the entire society that is maybe too moralistic, right? So I think there is a balance there, I guess, and I think that it's important, to have that balance. That's all I got.
I'll push back. I'll say yes. And however, I think, well, let's take prohibition.
Wouldn't it be a semicolon?
Argument.
I don't know. I just wondering.
Yeah. Okay. Whatever. There's some kind of punctuation there. I think you can be I think you can articulate that prohibition actually is based in morality, but not a transcendent morality, a horizontal morality, justice. A lot of the temperance movement was arguing justice, that women were getting beaten up by drunk men. So, I mean, they didn't even have to drag biblical morality into it. So at that point, I think they're arguing morals. It may be just kind of a horizontal set of morals. So I would recommend that all laws in some ways are based in morality. I think where Americans are nervous is if the morals are a transcendent based set of morals. I think if it's articulated at a horizontal level, that we as Americans have said that equality is important, so therefore we will have affirmative action policies. Well, that's a moral policy based in a horizontal set of commitments, values that we have that doesn't even need to be based in a transcendent moral.
Really? You believe that racial justice doesn't have a transcendence to it?
No. I'm just saying you don't have to.
Okay, Chris, your thoughts on this?
I agree with Mike's initial that does it have to be? No. Would we like for it to be? I believe so. But then the question becomes whose morality?
Right.
Who's the arbiter? I keep thinking, and I tweeted this out earlier today in celebration of Dr. King, as opposed to, because I'm goofy about the letter from Birmingham jail. I think it's one of the best pieces of literature, period. Right, that for students, hopefully students get a chance to get into that document. But he said any law that lifts people up is just, right? Any law that lifts people up is just, right? Any law that keeps people down is unfair.
Then how do you explain the resistance today to laws that attempt to do so? So explain to me the opposition and how that fits into virtue and private morality, because there's opposition, all right, to the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which is attempting to lift people up. So what I guess I want to, and I think it's important for kids to understand, there's a debate here in some ways, and to a certain degree, there's, I guess, a morality in the opposition to the John Lewis Act.
This goes back to this narrowness of this transcendent idea, because you're going to have people that, one, I think there are going to be a group of people that are opposed to it simply for partisanship and political gain, knowing that perhaps they don't necessarily have platforms that will get a lot of people behind them to support them politically in terms of voting. So what you want to try and do is you want to try and limit access to voting to people that will vote against you. And the other part of that is is when you have this very narrow focus and thinking on certainly like the state level, you're going to restrict that because you want to maintain that power base. So the idea is that the laws that get passed within our state are going to be what we believe to be moral, not what the general population believes to be moral, not that horizontal idea, but certainly this very narrow vertical idea of what we believe to be moral. So then how do we accomplish that? We do not allow access to the polls.
Mike, Tim, any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's important to we just spent all this time trying to separate out civic virtue, morality, and you have to be careful. Students have to be careful about keeping them separate. So here's the way I think of civic virtue as what does it look like? That was a question earlier. It looks like tolerance, cooperation, and critical self-reflection or critical reflection. Let's be rational, right? Civic virtue is really the procedure. It's the values that guide our discussion. So when we have a debate about voting rights, factions are going to come in with their different values. Some may value the state's ability to make their own election laws more than they value the national government's. There's all these different values. What's frustrating about this current debate is the lack of debate, is the fact that we don't have the civic virtue to at least let's honestly and critically reflect on this proposal. Let's talk about the morals involved. and let's try to come to a compromise. That's what, to me, civic virtue is. So the John Lewis bill, to me, is not like, it maybe is a morality statement, but it's different than civic virtue. Civic virtue is the parameters to have the debate. And what's frustrating, and what, Putnam and a lot of other political scientists are now arguing, right, is that we have those structures are slowly but surely going away, to where now the public sphere has become this area where we're just debating public morals and private morals without any of the sort of guardrails to think, what's the main purpose of this? It's self-government, and it's to set up something that's going to be beneficial to all of us, to get back to Chris's articulation of Martin Luther King. Like, what will lift up all of us, right? And we're not having those debates. So I find that frustrating.
That's really Cicero. If you think about it, the greatest happiness to the greatest amount of people. So, I mean, so Dave, I mean, it's hard not to be, it's a great question. So how do you explain the reluctance of people to get behind something, right, like the John Lewis voting rights bill? That's a tough explanation without getting too worked
Well, no,
up.
I think you guys, I mean, there's raw politics that may be devoid of both virtue and private morality. I mean, that may be the reality, and students, you may have to deal with that. That, in the world that maybe you have not entered yet, that there is this reality of just raw politics and power, and maintaining power, which, goes back to Machiavelli and long before him.
I can't help but think that the 15th Amendment might be a great example of power politics, but yet it being rooted in a deeply important American value. I mean, all kinds of people get the right to vote, but it's the Republican Party who wants to be a national party. How can we get Republicans in the South? It's called the 15th Amendment. So power politics and moral, I mean, that to me is a classic Venn diagram there.
And therein lies, I think Professor Morris just hit it. Therein lies, the problem, and when we try to break down things of saying, well, power politics is always bad, or always negative. Well, we all know the history of Reconstruction, and maybe the 15th Amendment had a political motive behind it, and political power behind it. And it can say it was uplifting people, but there was politics behind it. I want to close our session with this, and really look at the time and place we live in. And this is something for the next 11 sessions after this, we're going to continually to revisit. And that is, there is so much literature on the decline of America. Are we facing civil war? Are we facing breaking apart? And I do believe this question is really at the root of it. It's about the virtues of the people, all right, the private morality, whatever you want to label on it. Do you see a lack or a decline in virtue, a decline in this notion of private morality as it fits with the state as one of the major issues that confronts America? And that's to all three of you, to kind of close this out. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I do, and I don't care. In this sense, I think. Well, now ask your question again. I may have started out incorrectly.
Okay, here I've just written a long article for the local paper on this, and my argument is there's a breakdown in the social contract. There's a breakdown in citizenship responsibility, i.e. virtue. And if we want to equate, the idea of private morality and its relationship to governance, that's where the breakdown is. The reason we're in the situation we are is in citizenship and in the breakdown of those virtues and those morals of being good citizens.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there. But again, I'm in maybe flogging this this for a long time. I think it's where we're at is kind of inevitable when you make a commitment to radical individualism. There's a Canadian philosopher that calls it expressive individualism, and his argument is it comes out of Freud, because when you combine Rousseau and Freud, you get radical, decentralized, expressive individualism that has no commitment to the polis, has no commitment to community. And I think you may be onto something there with that, David, that there is that the thinness between us. It's just so thin, and maybe not there because we bought into this radical, expressive individualism. Now, the good news is there's in history a lot of times things collapse and the phoenix rises. So will radical individualism be able to sustain itself with the psychological man is what this one Canadian philosopher has identified. Society cannot exist if the radical, psychological, internal, expressive self reigns. Will that collapse? It might. And then out of that, will we come back to, hey, we may need to have to talk to each other or buy cakes from each other or whatever it is. So I think there is a collapse, but I'd see it's kind of a natural collapse, but it may lead to it may lead to a reconstituting of society.
Chris?
I don't see it as a natural collapse. I would disagree, Tim. I think what we've seen has been egged on by certain entities within society. And certainly we have I think I would agree in the fact that we've gone overboard in terms of Marat. Without that other are my responsibilities of citizenship, because we forget to teach that sometimes, because you do have these rights as an individual, but as a member of society, I have responsibilities. But I don't think it's a natural. I think it's been egged on. I think we have to take a look at the role of media, and I think we have to take a look at the role of of capitalism within our society. People wanting to maintain what they have or get more of what they have, and they've been able to use that to then drive the masses. So I'm not sure that it was. I'm not sure that this drive has been organic.
Mike?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think we've had this strain of radical individualism from the beginning. Something different is happening in the last 50 years. And I'll go back to there's a lack of trust. And now, is that because of the expansion of the polis in 1965? That has something to do with it. It also had to do with the debacle of Vietnam. It had to do with the backlash to the civil rights movement and the other movements, right? In some ways, this egging on of individualism is a good distraction for us to not focus on our shared solidarity in terms of how we are oppressed and how we all have injustice in our life, right? So I think and I'm not so sure that this crash landing is going to actually be a rebirth. I don't know. But I think that has something to do with us trusting each other. And this is going to be super, super silly.
Super.
Yeah. But, Chris has a book. Tim brings tools, right? So I'm going to now share a portion of a song that I think captures this.
Are you going to sing it?
No, it's Macklemore and Ryan Lewis from Same Love. And it goes like this. It goes, no law is going to change us. We have to change us. Whatever God you believe in, we come from the same one. Strip away the fear underneath. It's all the same love. About time that we raised up. So that is Macklemore and Lewis. I heard that today, and I thought about this idea of law and morality and this idea of trust in society, and I wanted to share that.
It would have been better if you sang.
I don't hold lighters anymore at concerts, so I'm gonna.
I'll sing the next one. It's gonna be my shtick. I'm gonna have a song.
Well, to wrap us up, students, I'd like you to think about the breakdown of the social contract. because it's a contract, which means there's two parties. And as much as we want to blame institutions, as much as we want to blame government, I do believe we need to look inward. And again, there's just so much evidence of the diminishment of virtue, the diminishment of private morality. And I'm not going to attach it to Judeo-Christian. I think there is secular notions of morality, but it all comes down to the notion of responsibility. To what degree, if in fact we're going to be a government of the people, by the people, for the people, to what degree are the people responsible for what happens in the broadest and longest terms of government? So think about that as you're preparing for this question. Believe me, I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and we could go on for at least another 3 or 4 hours on this, but that's not what we're here to do. So we'll see you next time, next place, talking about another question involved in the national finals. Until then, peace, love, yogurt tacos. Bye-bye, bye-bye.